What's up everyone and welcome back. So today I'm going to be going through 8 different medicine ball exercises that I like to use with my boxing athletes. But before we jump into those 8 exercises, I want to give you a quick breakdown of why I like using medicine ball exercises with boxers. The main reason I like to use med ball work with boxers is that we can develop really good coordination, or more specifically, coordination that allows effective force transfer from the lower to the upper body. And then probably a lesser known reason that med ball work is really effective for boxers is that it develops a thing called hip-shoulder separation or hip-trunk separation. And basically what this means is that your hips and your shoulders can rotate irrespective of each other. And this is going to be really important to basically take load off the lower back, but also it means that your hips can rotate first and produce the power and then transfer this to the upper body and then through to the hands. And then on top of this, another reason this hip-shoulder separation or hip-trunk separation is really important. If we think about it from a boxing standpoint, when you load up for a punch, say a lead uppercut or a lead hook, you're really going to drive that rotation from the legs rather than having the upper body just rotate. So if we can have the legs really rotate first or the hips rotate first, we can effectively transfer force from the hips into that trunk, into the shoulders, and then into the hand. Whereas if all of that is moving as one rather than each different segment one by one, there's going to be far less force transfer and far less power into that punch. So this is why med ball work is really good to develop this hip trunk or hip shoulder separation. So one thing about med ball work that's worth mentioning is that it's often thought as this pure power-based exercise. But it's important to understand that when we're training for power, the equation for power is force times velocity. And although medicine ball exercises are obviously velocity dominant, they're not truly training this max velocity like punching, sprinting, or max effort plyometrics would be. So whether they're actually training power or just expressing power is kind of up for debate. But in saying this, medicine ball work still has a massive advantage over resistance-based work as there's no deceleration phase like there would be in, say, a landmine punch. And this is one of the main downfalls of exercises that claim to promote punching power like these landmine punches is because they have this deceleration phase. So as you near extension or even getting close to full extension, you're actually having to decelerate the bar. And this isn't conducive to improving your power output. So when we're comparing med ball work to traditional exercises that claim to improve punching power, I still think medicine ball work is going to be better for this because it has no deceleration phase into it and you can really go max intent or max output with these. So even though med ball work might not improve your max velocity and then have, a massive transfer to upper body power output, I think the improvement of coordination from these exercises will indirectly help with power output because you're then better able to sequence this force and power output from the lower body up into the upper body and through into the hands, which is obviously going to be important for a really effective and powerful punch. And then just another reason I'm really a massive fan of med ball work is that it's a good way to expose your core to high velocity movements. So a lot of boxers would be pretty accustomed to, high rep core work or maybe some strength work, but where medicine ball exercises also have another advantage is that you can expose the core and the trunk to very high velocities, which sometimes doesn't get trained in your traditional core training. And then just lastly, because a lot of med ball work is typically done with very high intent and high outputs, it means it's a great way to fire up the central nervous system before you get into a lifting or boxing session. So you can tack these on to the end of your warm-up before you get into a lift or even at the start of your boxing session as an extended warm-up. So yeah, let's jump into 8 of my favorite med ball exercises that I use with all of my boxers. So the first exercise on the list is just the humble med ball slam. Most people would have had some sort of exposure to a med ball slam, but typically they would have done it in, a circuit where they're doing 100 reps and it's more for conditioning. But I do think the med ball slam can be a great exercise for expressing really high intent and basically make the boxer feel like they're super powerful, which to be honest, I think is quite underrated. Then lastly, another awesome reason for including med ball slams is that we can get some high velocity core flexion. So again, back to that reason that I like med ball work in general is that you get some high velocity exposure to the core. And so just progressing your med ball slams, we can go into a rotational med ball slam. So again, key thing with med ball work in general is that you keep the volume quite low so the quality can be very high and focus on maximal intent each rep. And then this can be another way to expose the core and the trunk to these high velocity movements that you typically won't get in, loaded core exercises or the standard high rep core circuits that most boxers would be doing. And so just a key thing to note when you're doing rotational based med ball slams is that you're really loading it up and basically creating this like half moon movement as you go into the slam. You don't want to be not loading it up and not actually having some output or getting some force behind this. And then the other thing to mention is because we're using this half moon or semicircle action to go into the slam, the core muscles are basically going to go through this stretch shortening cycle action because they're going through a rapid eccentric contraction into a concentric contraction. And this is another reason that medball slams are a good option for developing an athletic core in boxers, because we're getting exposure to these eccentric and concentric muscle contractions. So next up, we have a bent over single arm medball press. I've actually only recently started using these, but I got these from Vernon Griffith, and they're a great one for getting that hip shoulder, hip trunk separation. Because we're in that bent over position, we're not getting as much contribution from the legs, and all of the rotation is actually having to come from that trunk. So like I mentioned earlier, that hip trunk, hip shoulder separation is going to be really good for getting effective force transfer from the lower body to the upper body. Because if all our body parts are just going in one motion, you're obviously going to be quite stiff and not going to get effective transfer of force and power from one segment to the other. So basically, you're just going to hold that hinged position in the bent over position, and you're going to go single arm, rotate through the trunk, and go straight into the floor. So moving into our med ball pass options, this is going to be the first variation that I've shown that really teaches you to drive force off that back leg and then into the med ball. One of the main reasons I like prescribing these is that you can really get that whip-like feeling from the hip. So this will be similar to that med ball rotational slam, where we're getting some good rotation through the trunk, but the emphasis is on really driving the hip and really driving force and power output from the hip into that med ball. So similar to the slam, we're going to wind up. This means we're going to get a good eccentric muscle contraction through this side of the core as we wind up, and then following, we're going to get a good concentric contraction. So using that stretch shortening cycle through this side of the trunk. The key thing to note is that as we're winding up, really make sure that you're producing the force and whipping that hip as we come through. So this is going to be key for getting that force transfer from that lower body to the upper body and into the med ball. So to progress the standard med ball rotational pass, you can add in an oscillation. And all the oscillation is that rather than letting the med ball go at this position, you're going to decelerate, bring it back, and then go again. So what the oscillation provides is a lot of stiffness because we're having to decelerate that high velocity movement. The reason that you want high core stiffness in a punch is because as you get to the point of impact with your punch, you want everything to be stiff to have effective transfer of that force and power into the punch. This core stiffness basically means that we're not going to have any energy leaks, meaning that all the power and force that we've produced through the legs is actually making it all the way up into our upper body, rather than getting to the legs and then there's a massive leak through the core of the trunk, and that force and power isn't actually being generated into the arms. So like I said, with the oscillation, rather than letting it go on that first movement, you're going to decelerate as quick as you can, bring it back, you'll decelerate at this point, and then we're going to go again. So it should be as fast and as aggressive as it can to actually make this exercise meaningful. So now we move on to our shot put based variations. And this is going to be, I guess, the most specific to boxing because we're going to be in that natural boxing stance. So a lot of boxers would have done these where they're just throwing the med ball at the wall. But the main thing to focus on when you're actually doing these, we're actually producing the force and power from the leg and whipping that hip like we were on those rotational passes. So a lot of the time I see when people are doing these, it's mainly just the upper body doing all the action and they're not actually getting the whip-like action from the legs. So what I actually mean by that is that when they're doing the movement, a lot of the movement is actually just coming from them pushing their arm. So similar to like a bench press movement. So what you actually want to see is that we're sitting back and kind of loading that leg as you would with a punch. And then the movement starts with the leg starting to extend, that force coming up and through the body into the med ball. So progressing our med ball shot put, we can add in an overcoming isometric in that end range position. So with this, you'll be standing with a med ball pressed up against the wall in kind of a rear hand crossed position, and you'll be pushing as hard as you can against the ball. So for 3 to 5 seconds, the key with this is that we're pushing as hard as you possibly can into the wall. So what this does is develops a stiffness around all the structures that you'll need to be stiff within a punch. So wrist, elbow, shoulder, posterior shoulder. And the aim with this is to make sure that we don't have any of those energy leaks. So most of you should know that when you're punching on impact, you'll have a large amount of stiffness through these structures, which will assist with getting a lot of power out of your punches. So pushing against the med ball as hard as you can, ensuring that there's a lot of co-contractions and stiffness going around all of this area. You'll push for 3 to 5 seconds, then you'll step back, and then you'll go through your normal shot put that I just showed previously. So what some coaches also claim this to do is act as like a post-activation potentiation sequence, whereby using the overcoming isometric and pushing as hard as you can, you're firing up your nervous system. So that way you get into the shot put, we should theoretically experience higher outputs in the shot put because we've fired up our nervous system before it. Whether this is actually true or not, I'm not completely sure. I think you'd probably need a bit more time between the priming movement and the other movement. but you know, the theoretical basis is there for it. And then the final progression of our shot put variations is the same as the other shot puts, but this time we're adding in a step back to it. So I like using the step back as a way to overload the legs and increase the contribution of the legs into the movement. So it's exactly the same as our shot put variation. So we're going to add just a slight lateral bound to really load the leg and make use of that stretch shortening cycle and the stretch reflex to then increase the output of the next movement. So like I said, just a really good way to overload the legs and increase the contribution from the legs into the movement. And that's it for today's video. If there's any particular med ball exercises you like doing for boxing, make sure you put them in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe.